Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the second installment of our little lecture series on the Industrial Revolution. The focus of this lecture is going to be on the so-called Second Industrial Revolution. So this is sort of that, if we look at the First Industrial Revolution as being one that's largely driven, let's say, by textiles, in which steam technology is becoming important. The Second Industrial Revolution, now we're going to be seeing the advent of electricals, chemicals, eventually a shift from coal-driven steam engines over to diesel, internal combustion engines, and so on. So this is really taking us from the period from about 1820, which is a little early, but all the way down to 1900 or so. The significant questions that we're looking at here are explain how innovations and advances in technologies during the Industrial Revolutions led to economic and social change. So there's that linkage, that piece there. And then on the other side, explain how industrialization influenced economic and political development from the period 1815 to 1914. So firstly, let's look at some really big, broad themes. It is during this phase now, where in the first lecture we were looking at really industrialization in Britain and a few select other areas, but mostly in Great Britain. Now we're looking at more areas experiencing industrial activity. So we could begin to see the industrialization of some parts of Germany, some parts of the Low Countries to a lesser extent, a little bit in France, but and we also see some in the western part of the Austrian Empire. And then, of course, if we consider Western culture as a whole, this would be the time in which the United States experiences massive industrial activity. Industrial processes become more complex during this time, so we're going to see the full advent of the application of other sources of power sources to industry. So this is where steam technology will be dominant. Then again, we will begin to see machinery that is operated by other power sources. Electrical power sources, for instance. So that's going to be one aspect of complexity. Another aspect of that complexity will be the full advent of assembly line procedures. And that will, again, continue to streamline the production process. It will shift the kind of work that has to be done in a factory. So there's a lot less technical skill that's required from the average worker. They do a lot of repetitive activities, and it puts a greater emphasis then on hiring skilled technicians who can service the machinery, keep the machines up and running. So engineers, for instance, will become much more important because of the way that industry has been changing during this time. Excuse me. We also see an innovation or an acceleration in innovation and technology, and that technology will become more accessible. And that leads us into other issues like consumerism. How certain technologies that might have been, and we know this sort of fundamentally, that when a new technology comes out, that individuals, it might be a very high price, so it's very costly for an individual to apply some kind of new technology in their own home. But as that becomes more commonplace, the price comes down, it becomes more accessible to a broader swath of society. So that's one aspect of it. Also, on the actual factory owner side of things, those technologies are becoming more accessible in terms of production as well. It's actually an advantage to those areas in which the industrial revolution is spreading. So, the British will innovate. They will try new water frames, or initially when you have water wheel technology attached to a factory. And then someone will bring in a steam engine, and there'll be an improved steam engine, and it'll become increasingly more efficient. For British factories, which industrialize first, the question becomes, when do we retrofit? When do the technological advances accumulate so much that it's time to get rid of that original steam engine that was running the power plant in my factory to the new and improved version. So at which point do we see an obsolescence of an older technology and it becomes now cost effective to put in a new one? New factories that are starting up in, let's say, North Germany, in Prussia, for instance, will begin applying those newer technologies right away. So, in effect, what happens is as other parts of Europe industrialize, the advancements will already be inbuilt to that industrialization. It means that some parts of Europe will really take off on a pretty steep trajectory in terms of competing with Britain as centers of production. The same could be said, again, for the United States. We'll also talk about certain government policies that will have to respond to this whole new mode of production. The fact that things aren't being made in the home or in small villages by craftsmen anymore, but they're being made in these new cities that are really centers or hubs of production, like Manchester in England. The boom and bust cycle, as consumer production becomes much more important, we'll begin to see the interrelationship between the sort of the Malthusian problem of inflation, how that affects the household economy, and the degree to which individuals can buy consumer goods, and how that affects now a consumer-based economy, leading to these boom and bust cycles. As population expands, wages will contract slightly. We might see a slight rise in the price of food. So that means that sort of the wealth of the family will shrink ever so slightly, making it less possible to buy new consumer goods, causing a contraction on the industrial side. That has a cumulative effect, and we see the famous boom and bust cycles of the 19th and early 20th centuries. We will also see, to some extent, the industrialization of agriculture. One French historian commented that the Industrial Revolution had as marked an impact on rural regions as it did in cities and on an industry itself. That farm life will become mechanized. Railroads will be built through rural areas that will make certain places that had once been inaccessible now quite accessible. Easier ways to get food and milk or whatever products to markets that were inaccessible at one point in time. I was recently watching a program in which they were talking about how on the opposite end of the spectrum, when rail lines were started to be closed in Britain and parts of Wales, actually, in the 1950s and 60s, that farmers who had once had ready markets for their goods now found themselves to be almost wholly cut off. And whole agricultural communities kind of were choked out by the fact that there were no longer any rail links or any really significant modes of transportation to get their to goods to larger markets. And so those economies had to sort of entirely reinvent themselves in the second half of the 20th century. Consumerism, I've already mentioned, the increased number of consumer goods, household goods that are available. We certainly take this for granted because we can go to Walmart, we can go to whatever our sort of box store is and acquire basically anything that we need. And certainly we can hop online and get it as well. But a consumer economy. It's not quite a consumer disposable economy. That's something that's a little bit more recent. But basically, we can acquire virtually anything. You will also begin to see how prices will be tiered so that there will be a common material culture throughout the various classes. Where, for instance, Chinaware will be common to every table in a Western industrialized nation. However, it's going to be a scale of quality. So among the wealthiest in the society, it might be, hand painted, whatever, Royal Crown Derby. In a middle class household, it might be a little bit simpler and might be mass produced. And in a working class household, they would still have that, but there would be other companies that would be set up to supply those basic needs for those individuals. And so therefore you will see how like the interior decor of homes will actually be quite similar across the classes when you really look past the colors and patterns and so forth that are used. But there's a larger pattern that's being established here. And finally, we'll look a little bit about how Prussia, as a newer industrialized state, manages itself. Some of the new technologies that we can look at, I've mentioned this already, the mechanization of the factory system becomes predominant. In steel production, we have the Bessemer process that makes a better quality steel. We'll start moving ourselves along to the development of structural steel that will change urban architecture rather significantly, allowing us to build taller, more structurally sound buildings in cities, so that churches, old Gothic churches, will no longer be the tallest structures in cities, but will be skyscrapers. Manhattan being the best example at the end of the 19th and the dawn of the 20th century. Mass production. This could be, you could look at this in two ways, the way that term works. Mass production, as classically understood, is, you're making one product and you're making it in volume to be distributed to markets, potentially even globally, depending on your country. The British example would be mass production could be exported around the world. But the flip side of that is also production for the masses, that we now have this large new consumer pool. And especially in cities where we have a new large urban culture that needs to acquire the household goods, it's not making them like it would in their village. You're not making your tables and your benches and your cutlery and carving it out of wood and so forth, as a rural village a couple hundred years before would have done that sort of thing. But now you have to market these things to a new wage-earning proletariat, a wage-earning working class. Electricity by the midpoint and the end of the century will become increasingly important as a power supply, as I've suggested already. And then also the advent of chemicals, like chemical dyes, for instance. Again, that's another development on top of the already booming textile industry that's so important to the first industrial revolution. Once you can apply now a process of chemical dye, you can make fabrics of all different colors and export very cheaply and export them around the world. On an art historical note, the development of chemical paints, Prussian blue being probably one of the great examples of that. Blue used to be a very difficult color to make. Let's say in the Renaissance, it required lapis lazuli. Now it's chemically produced with certain compounds, can also be placed suspended in oil and placed in like a kind of primitive plastic tube, so that artists can now go outside and they can paint en plein air, as the French say, in the plein air. And that is a term that's usually associated with the Impressionists. So one can say that the whole Impressionist movement is an artistic movement that is facilitated by the impact of industrialization on the arts. New technology creates a more integrated economic system. All right, and I've been mentioning this already, how different classes in society will share a basic set of consumer needs. Electricity is going to radically transform not just lighting, but then also how things are produced. Better steel is going to require upgrades to railways and so on and so forth. Increased coal production is going to feed into a greater need to transport that coal from one area to the other. So rail lines will become more extensive. I call this in the last lecture, I called this the sort of self-feeding aspect of the economy, that as one technology and industry advances, it requires or allows for the development of new technologies, new industries. Classically, this was the development of rails coming from how we get coal out of a coal mine to the pit head and then transporting that elsewhere. And then because we have rail technology, we need steel to build those railroads and to build those locomotives. And then we have more extensive, more efficient transportation system throughout the country. Now we get that coal as a source of power can be transported very rapidly to lots of different places. It has an impact on agriculture. A refrigerated car can now transport, let's say, milk from the center part of America to the coasts. So again, we don't see the little regionalized economies, whereas if we use America as an example in this case, whereas New York would have relied upon the agricultural communities of New Jersey, New York State, Connecticut, and new parts of New England to sustain its population. Now we can really shift the center of agricultural activity to the Midwest. The Northeast becomes rather suburbanized because New York City and Philadelphia and Boston, really its food sources are coming from much further afield than it could have before an industrial revolution. Marketing techniques, the Sears catalog famously, but marketing becomes an issue. How do we now sell people on buying all of these consumer goods? Then we have other technologies that we know quite well. The development of the telegraph first, the telephone later in terms of transportation, the speed by which and efficiency of the steamship in some cities, streetcars, will enable these larger populations to get around. The internal combustion engine previews the development of automobiles. And then in the early 20th century, the airplanes and even radio as a form of communication. All right, we're going to just pause there. We're going to flip over to the next installment of this one, a sort of part two of this sort of section of the lecture, just for the sake of ease, and so I don't have an overly large YouTube file. So anyway, all right, thanks for listening, but keep on listening. Bye-bye.